So once you create all the files and open them, you're going to get something like this. So let's start with the index.js file. So this file is going to include all the AJAX calls which we'll use to process the user inputs inside the index.php file. So the first AJAX call is going to be for the sign up form. So once the user submits the form, we're going to first prevent the default PHP processing, and we'll collect the user inputs, and then we'll send them to the signup.php file using AJAX. So if the call is successful, we're going to show an error or success message. Otherwise, we're going to show an error message. The AJAX call for the login form is going to be similar. The only difference is that if the AJAX call is successful, we're going to check if the PHP file returns success. Okay. So if the login is successful, this file is going to return success, and we will redirect the user to the notes page. Otherwise, we're going to show an error message. Okay. And finally, the AJAX call for the forgot password form is going to be very similar to the signup form. Now let's move to the signup.php file. So this file is going to process the user inputs of the signup form. So at the beginning, we're going to start a session and connect to the database, as we're going to be running some queries later on. So first we will check the user inputs. We'll define error messages, guess the user inputs, and we'll store the errors in errors variable. If there are any errors, we will print an error message. Otherwise, we'll prepare the variables for the queries. So first we're going to check using a query if the username exists in the users table. Okay, if that's the case, we're going to print an error. Otherwise, we are going to check if the email exists in the users table and print an error if that's the case. Otherwise, we're going to create a unique activation code and insert the user details, including the activation code, in the users table. And we're going to send the user an email with a link to activate.php. Okay, so the link is going to include their email address and activation code. Alright, now let's move to the activate.php file. So the user is going to be redirected to this file after clicking the activation link they will receive after signing up. So this link is going to contain a couple of parameters, the email and activation key. If one of these is missing, we're going to show an error message. Otherwise, we will first store these in a couple of variables, and then we'll prepare these variables for the query. So the query we're going to be running is going to be setting the activation field to activated for that email. So in the users table, our user's status is going to turn to activated. If the query is successful, we're going to show a success message and invite our user to log in. Otherwise, we'll just show an error message. Now let's move to the login.php file, which will process the user inputs corresponding to the login form. Okay, so the structure of the file is very similar to the signup.php file. So the main difference is going to be the query you're going to be running. So that query is going to check the combination of email and password exists. If they don't match, we're going to print an error. Otherwise, we're going to log the user in, which means that we're going to be setting their session variables. At the end, if everything goes fine, this file is going to return a success message. But first, we're going to check if the remember me box is checked. Okay, if it's not, we're going to print the success message straight away. Otherwise, we're going to create a couple of variables and store them in a cookie and also in the remember me table, as we have covered in the logic earlier. Okay, so if the query is not successful, we're going to print an error. Otherwise, we're going to print our success message. Now let's move to the rememberme.php file. So this file is going to be called at the beginning of the index.php file. So it's going to check if the user is remembered, okay? And if that's the case, we're going to log them in. So the structure of the file is going to be as following. We're going to check if the user is not logged in and we have a remember me cookie. So if that's the case, we're going to extract the two authentificators from the cookie. And then we're going to go to the remember me table and we're going to look for a record with authenticator 1. Once we find that record, then we're going to match the authenticator 2 that we extracted from the cookie with the authenticator 2 that we have in our table. Okay. If they don't match, we're going to show an error message. Otherwise, we are ready to log the user in. But before we do that, we're going to need to generate new authentificators and store them in a cookie and in the Remember Me table. And then we'll log the user in and redirect them to the notes page. Now we're going to move to the forgospassword.php file, which will process the user inputs corresponding to the forgoes password form. So the structure of this file is going to be very similar to the login and sign up files. The main difference is going to be the query. So when we run the query, it's going to check if the provided email exists in the users table. Okay. So if it doesn't, we're going to print an error message. Otherwise, we're going to get the user ID and we will create a unique activation code that we will insert in the forgoes password table along with other user details. Okay. And then we'll send an email to our user with a link to the resetpassword.php file. Okay. So that link is going to contain their user ID and activation code. If the email is sent successfully, we will show a success message.